Welcome to Crosswords, the podcast about practical Christianity. What does it look like to walk in Jesus' footsteps? How do I live in a culture hostile to godliness? These are questions that we'll answer on each podcast as we get our heart and mind on Jesus. All scriptures quoted are from the New International Version. You can follow me on Twitter at kingdom_saint. Walk with the Lord today and be a blessing. There are too numerous circumstances or reasons or events to list, so I can't make an exhaustive list of what makes somebody discontinue their commitment to their spouse. But what I can do is try to list the reasoning that should take place within us who belong to Christ so that we don't end up victimized by this mentality. Now, I'm going to put here that this idea that progressive and unrepentant sin is what could lead somebody eventually to think about divorce or even getting divorced. Faithlessness, for example. Somebody loses their faith. They lose trust, and they lose trust in God for whatever reason. And that can lead to immorality, lustful thoughts, lack of finding satisfaction with their spouse, or lack of satisfaction with themselves if they're single, right? This can apply both to the married or single people, but since we're talking about divorce, we're going to focus it on those who are married. And so that immorality, those lustful thoughts, that keeps on progressing. You don't repent from that mentality. Eventually, you will lack the self-control. You'll start looking lustfully at other people. You'll engage in pornography. You'll engage in flirting. And eventually, that leads to the manifestation of that sinful progression, which is adultery. And we can follow this either in the spiritual or in the physical realm. It's both the same. They both lead to the same place. And when somebody's mindset is in this progressive and unrepentant sin, divorce is imminent unless there is a reconciliation, first to God, an awakening and realization, right? First to God, that's the order. It's important. First to God, then to the spouse. In that order, in order for the repentance to be complete and for divorce to be avoided, that mentality of divorce. Now, if this happens between a Christian and an unbeliever, the Christian is that forgiveness is what is on God's mind always. God doesn't force marriage on people. If you decide to get married, you decided that, but God's going to hold you accountable to that marriage. Remember, He's the main witness of the covenant between you and your spouse. And so He won't force you to get married. You decide to do that on your own. But remember, He will not be pleased with divorce. He does not promote divorce. So when there is an issue between somebody that's not a Christian and a Christian, what God does is that He promotes peace. Sometimes the Christian has no other recourse. Like I said before, we can't control what people think or what they will do, which is why Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 7, he gives us these instructions. Now, I'm going to clarify, right? The context of this conversation is between Christians and Christians who got baptized who were already married to a non-Christian. Okay, this is not the case where we have a Christian, somebody raised in the church, and they decided to marry an unbeliever. No, that is not this case. We know the scriptures encourage us to marry other believers. We can find that in many passages. But in this particular chapter, Paul addresses the fact that, some people get baptized, but many are married and their spouse may decide not to get baptized for whatever reason. So that presents a problem, right? He says here, if the unbeliever leaves, let it be so. The brother or sister is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. So the encouragement here for the Christian is, how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? So if you're in that situation where, man, I became a Christian, maybe I should get divorced because my husband doesn't want to become a Christian. My spouse doesn't want to become a Christian. So they asked Paul those questions, and this was Paul's answer here in chapter 7. And if that unbelieving spouse is not content, they say, you know what, you became a Christian, I'm out of here. I'm not content with you anymore. I'm going to leave this marriage. And they go, leave you high and dry. You can't control him. You can't control that situation. So this particular unbeliever, Paul says here, according to God's word, he is not bound. God has called you to live in peace. You can't be in a marriage where the other person is not holding their bargain. It ceases to be a marriage. Marriage is not meant to enslave. But what God wants from the believer is to help their spouse become a Christian. And that's why we read here in the verses leading up to that, if a woman has a husband who's not a believer and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him, for the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. Some of them had that thought, oh my goodness, I'm a Christian, but my husband doesn't want to become a Christian. What does God think about that? Should I divorce this person because my children are not going to be holy? This guy's not a Christian. This lady's not a Christian. God says no. The Apostle Paul says, no, listen, you, the one who became a Christian, you sanctify your spouse so that your children are clean, they are holy. And it's going to be up to your spouse. You don't know, right, whether you will convert your spouse. So be patient. And that's why you'll find that repeated advice through chapter 7. Remain in the situation in which God has called you. He says it 3 times in that chapter. You don't know what God is doing. Remember the stages that we discussed 2 Sundays ago. You don't know what stage your husband or your spouse is at. They might be in the plowed stage. They might be in the rocky stage. You don't know. But God's doing a work there. So he encourages us to stay in that marriage if that is your case, unless the only time that you're free of that is if your spouse decides to say, nope, I'm out of here, and he abandons the marriage. In that circumstance, you are not bound. But as long as your spouse is content to live with you, your influence as a Christian is priceless. Because think about it, he's not going to have any other influence except you. So you need to decide when the marriage has been irreparably violated and offer peace and forgiveness if it has not been irreparably violated. So when does divorce take place? Well, we talked about that mentality of unrepentant and progressive sin, and we can talk about unrepentant adultery as well. If unrepentant adultery continues to take place, that also will lead to divorce. A spouse may dismiss their loyalty. They might fornicate with somebody else on a regular basis, thus implying that they might want to marry that person. And this is what the Jews were accustomed to practicing, by the way. They wanted to divorce to marry someone else. That's the direct question Jesus addresses in Matthew 19:9. They coveted somebody else's wife. So they were doubly guilty because they broke up 2 marriages, their own and that of the other person. And so adultery is a very special kind of fornication. What is fornication anyway? It's the act of sexual union between 2 people who are not married to each other. But it becomes adultery when one or both of the parties are already in a marriage to someone else. So the introduction of this third party adulterates the relationship between the husband and wife, just like the intrusion of a foreign substance adulterates that food or that medicine, spoiling its purity, as we had discussed last time. So we have to understand that Jesus here is calling us to raise the bar. His address in Matthew 19, which is one of the principal passages that speaks about divorce, was addressing this particular point of the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew 5, 27 to 28, he tells the people, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So Jesus is telling them, look, you know from the law that you shouldn't commit adultery. Matter of fact, adultery carried a death penalty, as you know. They were to be stoned. I already showed you that from Deuteronomy. But Jesus now is elevating the bar on marriage because he wants us to be a society, particularly the Christians. He was telling this to the Jews, right? Preparing them for kingdom citizenship, for the kingdom mindset. He says, examine your heart because that's where adultery begins. What you look at. He says, everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent, or if you're a woman and you look at a man with lustful intent, or whoever you are, whoever you're looking at with lustful intent, you're on your way to committing adultery. He says you have already committed it in your heart. So Jesus is elevating, raising the bar on adultery by pointing out where the problem begins. It begins in the heart. So if you're somebody who's not satisfied with your marriage, something's going on in your marriage. I don't know. Maybe you think it's too old. Maybe you think it's the same old. Maybe that's not doing it for you anymore. So you start feeding your eyes on lust. You start coveting your neighbor's wife. You start coveting someone else. You look at someone with lustful intent. That's when you have to stop it. Because if you keep going on that track, you will certainly be inviting divorce into your marriage. And this is the specific issue Jesus deals with in Matthew 19:9. These men, the Jews that were asking him these questions, the Jews that were practicing lusting or coveting after other married women, fornicating with them, to justify a divorce, or vice versa. They wanted to divorce to marry that other woman. And that's what Jesus deals with in Matthew 19:9. But before we examine those scriptures, I just want to make it clear that God hates divorce anytime, anywhere, for any reason. The fact that Jesus gave a clause that it was okay to do it in the case of in the case of adultery, doesn't mean that it's okay, that it's fine and dandy, that it should be a loophole that we should exploit, because God hates that kind of mentality. Even God himself tried to avoid giving Israel a certificate of divorce for many, many, many hundreds of years. He was trying to convince them, to appeal to them, to beg them, until he had no other reason than to do it. He was kind of cornered into making that decision. And that's really the only time that you consider such a thing, because you are left no other choice. You're left holding the bag, so to speak. There's nothing else that you can do. And that's unfortunately the nature of the human heart. The Jews here were trying to seek a loophole in the law. They wanted to know what they could get away with. And that in itself is the nature of sin. What can I get away with? What can I do in order to exploit the loopholes? What are the loopholes so I can have the best of both worlds? And in the Old Testament, adultery was often seen as a loophole for divorce. But not even adultery, because remember, adultery carried the death penalty. And we're going to examine some scriptures. I'm going to bring up some scriptures again to let you know, to show you how they were divorcing for any reason. They were trying to be displeased with the smallest thing just so that they could have an excuse to divorce their wife. And that's why they asked Jesus in Matthew 19:3, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause, for any and every reason. So what were they looking for? Were they looking to honor marriage? Was that their concern? Oh, Jesus, I want to honor marriage. No. They just wanted to exploit the loophole. And so Jesus, he doesn't respond to that question in particular, because it's really the wrong question to ask. I mean, think about this. If you were about to, if me as an officiant at the wedding, I'm going to marry these two people, and they come up to me and say, oh, Pedro, how can I get divorced? What's one way that I could get divorced? And they're not even married yet, and they're coming and asking me that question. You would think that to be strange, wouldn't you? Well, why are you asking about how to get divorced if you want to get married? That doesn't make any sense. That would be like somebody comes up to you, he wants to get baptized, and he says, well, what are the reasons that I could get out of this baptism once I get baptized? It doesn't even make sense, right? I mean, who asks a question like that? But yet, that was the question that these Pharisees were bringing up to Jesus. They didn't understand, really. Somebody who asked this question just does not understand the sanctity of marriage. They don't understand the nature of covenants, that they're binding unto death, which is why the first thing that comes out of Jesus' mouth trying to answer this question is, have you not read that at the beginning, the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason, man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. I mean, nobody had ever said this before in the Old Covenant. It was a brand new idea. It says, what are you talking about? Even though we had read, right, from the prophets in Micah and other places, how God is the main witness of your marriage covenant, and how God hates if you treat the wife of your youth in a certain way. Even though they knew those things, they were still not understanding the sanctity of the marriage covenant. So Jesus, what does he do? In his answer, he brings them back to the beginning. He says, look, from the beginning, it was not like that. It was something that God united for the purpose of being together without being separated by any man. It was designed to be an everlasting covenant, not to be broken by anybody. And so when divorce enters somebody's mind, right away they're violating the sanctity of the covenant of marriage. It reduces the covenant to a lie, doesn't it? Because if two people were there and I married them and they vowed to each other in sickness or in health, for better or for worse, and then all of a sudden 5 years later they made those vows a lie. They dishonored all the people. They dishonored us as witnesses of that covenant. You ridiculed yourself because you dishonored all the men and the women. You dishonored God to whom you made these vows. And even the witnesses at your wedding have been dishonored because you belittled the covenant. You violated the sanctity of it. You see, the disciples understood that. Maybe the Pharisees who were asking Jesus that question, they were not the wiser yet. But we can see towards the end of this discourse in verse 10 that what the disciples' response was. They said, if this is the situation between a husband and a wife, it's better not to marry. See, they understood, wow, this is deep. This is holy. This is, you got to really think about this. But yet, many in our culture, they use divorce as a loophole to get out of a marriage and to get another spouse. It's something that still continues. That mentality is not new. It has been going on since the days of old. And that's why Jesus will say here, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Here, Jesus is contrasting the Old Testament attitude that had developed in the Jews versus the reality of what was from the beginning. You divorce your spouse without just cause, you leave them open to be the victim of adultery, as well as anyone who marries her. So there's a lot of adultery going on just by one person's lack of self-control for lusting after somebody else. I want you to look at this passage. It's a passage that we studied before in Deuteronomy 24, 1-4. And this describes what was in effect at the time of the law of Moses. This is what's said in Deuteronomy in the law. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, sends her from his house, and if after she leaves his house she becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, sends her from his house, or if he dies, then the first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again after she has been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. Why do I bring this up? Well, I want you to notice from this passage how in the law of Moses there was divorce and remarriage happening, and to a certain extent almost even sanctioned by the law, even under this strict Old Testament law. But remember, this example of divorce, notice how it is because he finds something indecent. And in our last class, I had discussed the difference between this reasoning for divorce and the other one, which was adultery. And that one carried the death penalty. So obviously this one in Deuteronomy 24 is not because of adultery, because if it was, then he wouldn't be talking about her marrying someone else. No, they would be talking about stoning her because of adultery. So this is an example of divorce and remarriage happening here because the man is claiming that there's something displeasing, something he doesn't like. And this is pretty much the picture of what happens in the world today, no? I mean, this is describing why people get divorced and sometimes married a second time, married a third time, married a fourth time. They are not keeping their vows. They are treating marriage with disrespect. They are not treating it with the holiness that God is calling us as his people to honor marriage. And that's why we of all people need to make sure we're not following this kind of pattern of thinking here. Oh yeah, if I find something displeasing, I'll just divorce her, give her a certificate of divorce, and go on to the next one. That is not what God desired from the beginning. You know, as disciples of Jesus, we need to hold marriage to a much higher standard, as he says. And so many times people will cite in their divorce proceedings or in their filing for a divorce, they'll say irreconcilable differences. That's the excuse, right? Most of the time, which kind of mirrors what's happening here in Deuteronomy 24. So most of the time people are doing it and there even hasn't been an adultery. At least if there was some adultery, then you know what? You got a reason, because Jesus did give us that excuse. Hey, you know, if there is sexual immorality, if there is an adultery, then well, then you might have some justifiable cause. But even then, as people of God, that shouldn't make us jump for that loophole and use that, okay, you know what, there was adultery committed, I'm out of here. You know, no, we're called to make our marriage honorable. We want to have the mindset of God to try to forgive, to try to work out the marriage, because we promised for better or for worse, for rich or for poorer, in sickness or in health. Those were the vows we made before God. But some people, like Jesus said, you know, Moses permitted divorce because of hardness of heart. Well, that is what was happening here in the days of Moses. They had irreconcilable differences. They didn't want to work on them. They got tired. They wanted to find something else. And so they made up the excuse for being divorced. Now, notice that the mentality described here again is that exploitation of the loophole, you know, the reasoning for divorce. Can we divorce for any reason? Because that's what they found in the law. But Jesus will reply to them in Matthew 19:9 that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. Now I'm looking at the time. It's already 8 o'clock and I'm not finished. I thought I was going to finish today, but I haven't, and I still have a lot to discuss. So I'm going to move it up to the questions, and we'll finish this in our next class, God willing. If you have any questions, just remember to text me, and I might feature your question. If it's not in the notes already, I might feature it in the next class. And so today, let's see. I guess we can discuss questions 1 and 2. I didn't even get to discuss much of how to answer 2, but we'll leave that 2 also for our next class. But let's talk about what are some things that can lead to divorce. I did discuss some of the mentality, right? The progressive, unrepentant sin, the lusting, the coveting that starts in the eye, that starts by looking at someone else, desiring someone else, not being satisfied with what you have. So some of those things, you can discuss, how that happens and how that may lead to divorce. The second question is, what are ways that we can prevent our mind from settling on divorce as a solution? Because some people think that having the divorce is the solution. Hey, I'm unhappy. My wife is not satisfying me. But you might think that this other person at your job, your coworker who's paying attention to you, or your neighbor who's making googly eyes at you, you might think that you can find some satisfaction there. But guess what? That's called the grass is greener on the other side syndrome. And that's one way of saying FOMO, right? Fear of missing out. That's one of the ways you think, I might be missing out on something here. So let me go over there. And you know what happens? You always discover that the grass was just as burnt on the other side. That's what you discover eventually. And that it's within your power to have made the grass on your side green all along. You have the power to do that. The solution is never divorce. That leads to more problems. The solution is fix what's going on in your mind. Fix what's going on in your heart. What are you doing with your eyes, right? That's why I wrote down there a hint. Eyes. Another hint, FOMO. Are you thinking that you're missing out on something? If that's where your mind is at, you're missing out the wife that God gave you. You're missing out on the husband that God gave you. You got to explore what you got right there in front of you in your situation. And you know what? That can go too for those of you who are single. You got your mind so much on marrying somebody, that's not going to let you enjoy what you got right in front of you. Right? So FOMO can work either way, for the single or for the married. They can lead you down that road of lusting and adultery and sexual immorality, which is not God's way. You're not going to find God's blessings there.
Thank you very much for listening. I hope the Lord gave you insight into conforming to Jesus with today's message. I always appreciate feedback. You can send me your thoughts, musings, and comments directly through the Anchor app. You can also contact me on Twitter at kingdom_saint. Walk with the Lord today and be a blessing.